kinds of things, we wait for that as developers. And that waiting time is time when the CPU is idle, when we can't really do anything. But it's what we're used to as developers. This whole blocking synchronous process of things, well, we've got to try and find alternatives to it to be able to save ourselves time and to be able to serve more requests in general. And the message that I have for you today is the same message with completely different content that I had for you yesterday. It is that we can write asynchronous code in PHP. But where yesterday I looked at using extensions and third-party libraries to do interesting new architectures, today I'm going to look at just one keyword in PHP, the yield keyword, and how using generators we can do this kind of thing. But where does it all begin? Well, you've undoubtedly seen code like this, or if you're from the PHP 5.3 era, probably code like this. The important thing here is that PHP has a bunch of different data structures, and the one we're going to focus on today is arrays. There are lists containing items of other PHP data types, and we can step through them. We can step through them with a for each loop. We can step through them by using indices on a for loop. We can use while loops. We have these programming structures that we can use to step through arrays, and at each step we can get the value for them. We also have an aptly named and pretty useful function for determining if a variable is an array. But what about things that look and act like arrays that aren't? What about things like the DOMDocument? If you've not used this before, it's a class in PHP that takes a string of HTML or a file name to a file that is a string of HTML and converts it into a magical hierarchical structure that you can step through. We can, in this instance, get all the div elements in this very simple single element document that we're creating and step through them to get details from them. And if we try as array, we're going to get false because it's not an array. It's an instance of a class. But we can determine if it is traversable with this bottom line here, if it's an instance of traversable. Now, if, like me, the first time I saw this keyword, you thought to yourself, that's cool. Maybe I can make my own array-like thing. Maybe you tried something like this. And the error you undoubtedly would have got is that you can't make something that implements traversable. The error would also have pointed you in the direction of the iterator interface, and we'll talk about this now. But traversable is an internal interface. You can't implement it. It's just there to screw with you. You can create your own traversable thing by implementing Iterator. And the Iterator interface requires these 5 methods. I'll talk about them briefly. Current and key return the value and the key at the position of the iterator's internal pointer. Okay? In a list of 1, 2, 3, the very first value that current is going to give you is 1, because the internal pointer of that array is at 0. And if you step through that in a loop, you're going to get 2 and 3 successively as current values. For the keys, you'll get the same, because by default, PHP arrays are numeric based with a 0 index. Next advances that pointer. So, it's the function that's called by PHP when you're doing something like a for each loop, and it has to progress to the next item. It has to advance the internal pointer. Rewind is meant to put that pointer back at the beginning again. So in our list of 1, 2, 3, if you're at 3 and you call rewind, the pointer is going to be pointing at 1. And valid is PHP's way of telling whether after it's read an item from an iterable thing, whether there are more items to read. So in that list of 1, 2, 3, if you're doing a for each loop over it, the moment you've read 3 and you call valid on this iterator, it's going to return false. And that's how PHP knows to stop trying to get values from it. You use it in the same way as you would use DOMDocument or an array in terms of the iteration. And it is an instance of traversable. You can also say instance of iterator, but perhaps it's simpler just to have 2 ways of checking whether something is iterable. To say is array and an instance of traversable. Even though it implements the iterator interface, this still returns true. You'll also notice that it's accepting a constructor argument of a simple array. That's not actually part of what you have to do to make a custom iterator, but it makes sense that if you have a custom iterator, you base it on some kind of pre-existing iterable thing. Generally, if you make a custom iterator, you'll have a constructor that either accepts an iterator or an array or something else that is traversable, because generally what you're trying to do is not implement basic array functionality, it's to augment it, to do something meaningful that is not covered in the default PHP core functionality. You can cheat a little, and instead of implementing iterator, you can implement Iterator Aggregate. And this just has one required method. It's the getIterator method. As long as that method returns an instance of an iterator or an Iterator Aggregate, this interface, this contract, is fulfilled. So you can use a default iterator, you can return that with getIterator, and you can avoid making those other 5 methods, which sometimes is a lot of overhead for very little gain. And PHP has a lot of these built in. If you go to this list, the URL is quite small, but it's php.net/manual/n/spl.iterators.php. There is a long list here. Check that scroll bar on the right. There's a long list here. And what you're going to find is that often the iterator that you want to make is covered by some of this functionality. The worst thing you can do is not check here when you want to make an iterator, because if you go and re-implement something that's here, you're going to feel pretty dumb and you're going to waste time. Look here first, and part, if not all, of what you need for your custom iterator is provided by one of these classes. So perhaps decorate it. Perhaps take one of these as a constructor argument and add some functionality on top of that. That seems to make sense. Now there are some problems which this library I'll talk about now solves. Iterators are really useful and are really well embedded in the PHP core, but PHP also has a lot of methods for dealing directly with functions. I'm talking about things like array map, array filter, things like that deal very well with higher order functional programming concepts and arrays, but aren't compatible with iterators. You can't put an iterator into array map. It's going to tell you this isn't an array. Sure, you can convert the iterator to an array using another method called iterator_to_array, again, very aptly named, but that takes away the benefits of having the iterator in the first place, or later, as we'll see, the benefits of having a generator. What we want is to be able to use this stuff, these cool array methods, with iterators or with arrays, and not have to worry about whether something we're giving it is an array or an iterator. We just want to use the same methods and have the language work out what kind of structure we have. And that is what this library aims to solve. It has a large collection of high-order functions for working with iterable things. So whether you pass an array in here, or an iterator, or an iterator aggregate, or a generator, the same methods will work. You'll be able to do things like map and filter and reduce. All the kinds of things that you can do just with standard arrays now, you'll be able to do with all of those traversable types. If you want to learn more just about this library and about ways that you can use generators generally in PHP, this is an interesting post that was posted recently by me, sorry for the show, but this is a good post to learn the iterable side of generators. It shows off some things of the library. The post itself is a look, the example code in the post is a look at parsing large CSV files and connecting them via foreign keys in each CSV file. It's actually an interesting application of generators and iteration in general. So check that out if you want to know more just about the basics of iteration and generators. But what does this have to do with generators? Starting PHP 5.5, we have the yield keyword. And when a function has that yield keyword in it, invoking the function doesn't just give you the return value of that function. It gives you an instance of a generator. Now, when I first started experimenting with generators, I was interested in what functionality they provided. So I did things like class get methods on an instance of a generator. And what I saw was that, by and large, generators have the same kinds of properties and methods as an iterator. They are simply a bit of syntactic sugar to give you an iterator without having to implement those 5 methods we saw, or wrap another iterator to implement Iterator Aggregate. They're a shortcut to making iterators. So everything you can think of to do with iterators, and all the libraries that you will need to get iterators to work nicely in high-order functions like array filter and array map, apply equally to generators. Let's look at some examples of this. The first example, quite common, is reading files. Perhaps you don't write code to syntax highlight a file's contents every day, but you probably often need to get the contents of a file to do something else meaningful in your application. We can write a traditional PHP function to do this, a function I've called lines, which creates a temporary storage area for each line of the file, opens a handle to it, and until the end of the file gets every single line and adds it to that temporary storage, remembering to close that handle off, of course, just to be memory efficient. And at the end returns an array of all the lines in a file. And because it's an array, we know we can use for each on it. We can step through each point of that array and add a line number, add a line break. So, for instance, if you were putting this out in an HTML page, this would give you line numbers and new line breaks after each line. It's traditional PHP, right? It's nothing too complex here. But what would we do to get this to be a generator? Suggestions. This is an easy one. So how would we convert this to a generator?
Just stick yield in front of the fgets?
Yes, just stick yield in front of the fgets. We can do away with the temporary variable because we no longer need to store the whole array in memory. And when PHP sees this yield keyword, on an invocation of the function, remember it doesn't look for the return value of that function. You get an instance of a generator. So the process that's going on here in PHP is the first time this iterates, the very first cycle. It opens a handle, and until the end of the file, it gets the first line and yields it, and then stops. It stops at that point. So what you get here on the first iteration is a zero-based index, because we're not yielding a key, and the first line of the file. But the file handle is still open, hasn't closed, it hasn't gone through the whole file. PHP is just stopped at that point. The second, third, fourth, up until the second last iteration, all it does is it picks up at that semicolon, sees, okay, I'm still in a loop, let me check for the end of the file, get that line and yield it again. Just those 3 lines are run up until the second last iteration. When it's read the last line, and after it's yielded that line, that while condition will return false, because it will be at the end of the file. So, after the semicolon, it will see, I'm still in the loop. That condition is false. Let me close the file handle. And internally, calling valid on this instance of the generator will return false. So PHP will stop iterating over it. Now, there are some immediate benefits to this, which perhaps you've guessed already. Look back at this. What would happen if we had a 5 megabyte file that we were loading in here? Suggestions. What would happen if we were trying to load a 5 megabyte file in here?
It would take 5 megabytes.
Yeah, it would take 5 megs of memory. It would take a little bit more, like insignificantly more, but it would read every line of the file, store it in that array, and return the array at the end. So the value, the size of this variable here, would be 5 plus megabytes. If we use generators, the memory that's taken up at any one time is for that open file handle and the single line that gets yielded. Everything else is gone, unless you store it somewhere else. An immediate benefit to using generators is that you use significantly less memory. Load that 5 meg file up and you're going to still use about 500 kilobytes for running this maximum, yeah?
The key is always zero-based index?
The key is, in this case, yes, it's a 0